Alright guys, this video I'm going to run through a couple of things to try as you sort of develop your V-Ray rendering for project 2. Now this, I'm going to show you first a couple of modifications I made to this model where it ended, just to use it as an example. I think that one of the things that I realized as I started doing this, or did a couple of renderings, was I realized, for example, that I wasn't too happy with how these sort of wire mesh railings, even after I had applied materials to it, seemed very floaty because it didn't have the edges, right? Which is actually in the photos of the actual building. So I went back and added those. So sometimes you'll find that when you start rendering and when you start applying materials, you'll figure out that, oh, I need to add this or that, right? So always kind of be able to go back and fix a couple of things, okay? So that's these guys. And sometimes what I do with this is just like select everything on the layer and isolate. So I'm using the isolate command, right? And I know basically I want the edges for these. Okay, so I'll do duplicate edge and just pick the tops and the bottoms in one of these, right? I'll group them and then I will run a pipe command. So I should actually select the group, pipe, just run it right after, right? But these are just the lines. I'll do 0.2, too large, 0.05. Let's see, show selected, see how that works. Okay, that looks decent compared to maybe actually a little bit smaller or skinnier. So I'll undo that. Select that group again, right? Pipe 0.02, and then this is in feet, right? So okay, that looks probably a bit closer. And one thing that once that's done, you can actually just like delete those lines because you don't need them anymore, right? So I just kind of go around and do the same to all of these. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 on each side, right? Sometimes I'll join them or just group them and just run the pipe command right after, accept same things. Once it's done, just delete and it will delete your source curves. So it makes it really fast and easy. This will have to kind of make sure to go through and pick correctly. So top, bottom on both edges. Oops, not that one. You can use the control to unselect. Like that. All right. Okay. Join pipe, and then delete. Okay, so now I have little rods, along that whole thing, show everything. Okay, so now I know that that's, I have edges on those things now. It looks a lot better, right? And then the other thing I'll do is these, right? If I also did kind of try to apply a material to that, a sort of like open web material as well. But as you can kind of see, it doesn't actually, there is something there, but it's, it looks like a wire mesh. It doesn't convey the sort of thickness of the sort of kind of waffle open mesh that it actually has. So I will actually model that, right? So the idea is like to just draw a bunch of lines, basically a bunch of squares, and extrude it. Now in this case particularly, the same thing, isolate it. In this case, I actually cheated a little and I used a Grasshopper script here, oops, that I kind of did beforehand, which you guys will learn later on in Advanced Digital. But I did a Grasshopper script that actually just took the planes, subdivided it, and extruded things for me. This is a little bit of sort of math or visual programming that you can learn. And I'll just take these extrusions, bake them, meaning that they are going to be put on some layer. Actually, I might have to, here's exterior, okay. Which will make them for me, okay. All right, and I'm gonna select everything that was newly created. And because I know these are probably going to be kind of above where they should be because I extruded them upwards, I'm actually just going to move them vertically down. So down here, which is where they actually should be. And so we'll have a bunch of these like surfaces. These we eventually are going to have to delete out. So these surfaces on the top, right? Because these are the actual locations of the treads that we're looking at. Okay, so once that's done, then we actually have something that will look a lot closer. And while we're at it, I would probably just like loop everything, otherwise you will get a lot of kind of little bits flying around. Okay, so get that, group it. All right, so show everything. Okay, so that looks much better, right? Like an open kind of steel waffle grid, as well as the stairs and steps. It's a pretty quick way. But even if you don't know Grasshopper, you just basically kind of like draw, 2-inch or 3-inch sort of lines, kind of copy or offset them each way, right? And then just extrude it. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward. Okay, so we're done with that sort of like modeling part, and to kind of get a sense again, we can initialize the render, interactive render, and you'll see that this looks a lot, whoops, zoom out a little. This will look a lot more realistic, especially if we're kind of close up to it. Oh, the sun's not on this side, so let's look at this side. Okay, so obviously these have actually look weird because right now they have the wire material applied to them. So I'm actually going to go really quickly and just apply this layer to the exterior stairs. So that's the galvanized steel, and now you'll see the waffle grid kind of show up, right? And it looks pretty cool, or pretty similar to what it would be. Okay, great. Okay, so a couple topics I want to touch on today really quick. In particular is like related to actually how to apply and map the materials, similar to how I showed in lecture earlier this week. Okay, so to kind of do that, so it's a more from scratch kind of file. This is a different earlier file without anything in there. None of the materials are applied really beyond the original like Rhino glass. Okay, so this one is looks just like this. It's a white sort of rendering. Okay, and so to touch on a couple things to remember here, that we'll use the interactive rendering for kind of developing scenes and materials just to kind of look, get a better sense of how they look, right? But obviously you have to switch it off and go to the normal kind of CPU render when you kind of do your final renders, right? Under that, right, there are under the global illumination, typically by default it is brute force light cache, right? Brute force for primary rays, light cache for secondary rays. For exteriors, this is probably fine. You can probably kind of chew through these on medium quality, pretty in a decent time frame, 5 to 10 minutes at most. If you're doing an interior render, then I would actually change the first setting to irradiance map, like to IR. Irradiance map will calculate it a little bit faster. Like keep it at medium if you can. Okay, so that's just something to kind of keep in mind. Brute force is more accurate. Irradiance map is kind of more approximate. You might lose or you might get a little bit of splotchiness here or there if your settings are too low, but I think for the speed it's not a bad trade-off, right? Also, when you have the CPU renderer on, I would usually have this denoiser setting on because it will speed things up, especially in shadows in particular. Okay. Okay, so that's fine. Our render output is small for now. Okay, so let's go and try to do a material, right? This is kind of assuming you already have the Rhino document sun and you're using, in here, you're using the sky as the sort of background, just as we kind of showed in the lab assignment 8, right? Now here, on the very left, we have the materials panel, and you can pull this fly out here, and here are a lot of the sort of preset materials that V-Ray comes with, okay? And to kind of show you, because it's easier to see that way, I'm actually going to use a wood material. And you can use the slide to make the previews a bit bigger if you want to see a little bit better as you just kind of scroll through, okay? This is your material list inside the scene. These are the presets, and we can actually pull one of these, for example, right? And you'll get a little preview of it up here of how the wood in this case would look like. All right. Now, most of the settings are over here on this side, right? So that's a sort of wood, that's a material that has a kind of certain scale and texture to it, right? If it is more like either, let's say, a glass, right, then glasses are typically more like it's just a simple color or whatnot. The glass I use is this one, glass window neutral. It's just a very simple, fast glass, right? Clear. You can kind of see it a little bit. We can modify this eventually. Or you can actually just start, right, add material and do a generic. And a generic is actually just, a color, right? And you can change the color here in the diffuse channel. So if you want it to be whiter, like I said, I usually change this range to setting to 0 to 255 because this is more similar to Photoshop, and I'm more familiar with these kind of color values. So 0 to 255, a white realistically something like a 230 all across. Okay, so you get a nice sort of white. It's not overly white, right? So this would be a kind of a white material, right? So diffuse channel basically controls the color, right? The sort of diffuse color, right? So let's try applying two things. Some of these materials, two things, and the first thing to kind of just demonstrate is how to do material mapping, okay? And sometimes when I do this, I will actually, it's the same thing, right? I'm isolating certain things, so I will select the wood interior thing, sort of layer, and I will isolate it. Oops. Right, so I'm only looking at these. This is usually developing materials or kind of trying to apply materials. This will give you a better sense because stuff is in the way, shadows don't really affect it, that sort of stuff. All right. So if we take this, for example, this wood flooring laminate like material, and then just apply it to layer like this, right? You can there are 3 ways to apply things. You can select things one by one. You can apply to selection. So if I select something first and apply to selection, you can do it that way. In our case, we've sorted things by layer, so I'm just going to apply it by layer. Okay. Now, if I run the interactive rendering, then you will see, right, the material actually being applied onto the geometry. There's actually a slightly easier way to do this, is actually just look at the rendered viewport, the rendered mode. The rendered mode gives you a pretty good depiction, right, of the material applied. And you can obviously see the problem right away is that, you know, the scale of the material is wrong, and it's actually a little bit all over the place. It's like, this is really big, this is really small, some are vertical, some are really wide and fat, right? And that's kind of like just the default. If you just apply materials to something in Rhino, it basically takes the object size into question and tries to take this map. So if we're looking at this diffuse channel, there's a little checker box that's blue. It means that there's a bitmap being used, right, to basically act as the diffuse color, right? So they're basically taking this square decal, right, the square texture, and like wrapping it onto things. So if it's smaller, then it will be smaller because they're kind of squeezing it. If it's bigger, then it's bigger because they're basically taking that and kind of stretching it, right? So it's really dependent on the sort of object size, okay? Now, to fix that, what we would have to do is to basically select everything in that layer, and you can also use the layer selection, so select objects like that, okay? Under your properties tab right here, go to the texture mapping, okay? And you'll have a lot of like texture mapping options, you know, surface, planar, box, spherical, blah, blah, blah. Most of these you won't really use unless you're really doing like weird spherical or cylindrical stuff. The default, I would say, generally is this, so the box mapping. So if you click it once, you'll get a dialog up here to ask you to select bounding boxes and things like that. I just accept the default just by going enter, coordinate system world, enter, capped, yes, enter, right? And as you saw when it was kind of doing that, it gave me a sort of large bounding box around all my geometry, meaning that it was going to use that box as the sort of mapping reference, right? So that large box that was there is now taking the decal and it's being stretched that box. Now we can, if you kind of group it, so at this point I would, just so you don't mess it up, you can actually modify that, right? And so this here, show mapping, will give you a visual of what that sort of mapping widget or thing looks like, right? So this is the mapping widget. You'll see when I try to click on it, there's a bunch of them, right? Because it's basically one for every single item in here, but just select everything together, right? And so what you'll see is this is a kind of visual way of, let's say, oh, I can move, right, the positioning of the texture. I can even rotate it if I wanted to. So I want to turn it 90 degrees, right? So you can use the widget to turn it like that, right? And as I made those changes, you'll see those changes are here too, right? So when I turn it 90 degrees in the z-axis, then this became 90. But if I set it back to 0, then it turns back to its original orientation, right? So this actually controls its positioning as well. This one, XYZ size, actually changes the size of the overall mapping kind of projection, right? So what we want to do actually is, and this is usually what I do for box mapping, is I set these to x equals y equals z, so it's still a cube, right? And so these are all evenly sized now, right? There's not, sizes are really long and really short, right? So it's a sort of even mapping size. I will lock them, which means that once I change these numbers, they will all stay the same. And I'll make them, in this case, make them much smaller, so 5, right? That makes them 5 across the board. So 5 is probably, for this roof, right, might be a little small. But for these interiors, right, once you kind of imagine it in context, that actually might seem okay. It might still be actually a little bit too big for the stairs, right? So let's try maybe 2 or 3, right? But that kind of gives you a sense. Now, obviously, this actually is one of those where, you know, the texture kind of scale is very obvious, right? So you can kind of see the repeating a little bit more. If you feel like, for example, I want to make it longer, right? So like they're not so short, like the boards aren't so short. Then you can unlock it and say, okay, well, maybe let's try to make the Z sort of longer, right? So let's double that Z to like 6, and you'll see that those boards get longer. So you can kind of tweak this, right? And make it actually look more to your liking. And I like, usually with these sort of wood materials, like you have to kind of have a little length for it to look nicer, right? Now the actual project doesn't use a wood that is like has this such a strong texture, right? And so what I would do in this case is actually delete it, remove it from the scene, go to the wood and kind of find one that's maybe like this, right? Laminate A2, which is a bit more neutral, right? The things aren't like as kind of prominent, right? The texture, the grain isn't as prominent. You'll see when I delete it, then things get reverted back to normal. Let's apply to wood interior. Okay, so you'll see that because I did the mapping before, now, right, everything still keeps the original sort of mapping scale, right, of the objects that we did before. Okay, so this actually might be, for this texture actually might be too long. Okay, so I'll just like select everything and like dial this back to like 6. Kind of take a look and see, okay, that maybe seems kind of okay, right? But you can always modify this back. All right. Now, sometimes if you have objects that are really small versus things that are like really big like this, right, where you kind of see this repeating, okay, then I would actually, for like this thing in particular, do its own mapping, okay? So I would like ungroup this, right, select this individually so you're only modifying it, and then, lock it, kind of change the scale of it so it's like, yeah, it's not like that large and distracting as a sort of overhead, right? Otherwise, sometimes like that gets a little bit too crazy. Okay, so that just kind of gives you an idea. You can kind of move this around, you can rotate it, things like that. But this just kind of gives a sort of larger overall texture. So that's actually how you do mapping. It's actually the same for everything else. Basically, everything that you assign in here you will have to kind of do the step for every texture that has a scale, right? For things that are, for example, like most of the metals where it's just, oh, that's a color and a sort of sheen, then, or the glass, then there's no mapping you really need to do. It's just like anything that has a sort of specific scale to it. Okay, so we'll show everything. If you want to hide this, then just go back, select everything in that layer that you had, right? Go here and then just like click on hide mapping, so the mapping would just sort of disappear and they're not in there. Okay. All right, so that's just applying mapping really quickly. I will mention that, for example, let's go to layers, right? Let's select the wire mesh, select objects here, and go to metal. So we can find an open mesh, like I think the one we were using was this one, okay? So this is a metal pattern bump. If you look at this type of material, a material like this, you will see that basically in the opacity channel in particular, right? Its diffuse channel is using something, just the color, right? It's kind of metal, metallic sheen. Its opacity channel is actually using a bitmap that looks like this. So white is solid, black is sort of not there, right? It's transparent. And that's actually how it's getting this look, right? So if I apply it, so let's apply to layer, whoops, and go to wire mesh. So you'll see that it applies the wire mesh in a very sort of haphazard fashion, like just like you saw, that bitmap is stretched or crushed to fit these different geometries. So it's the same thing, we just have to like come here, and this would look really weird if we actually looked at the rendering. Come here, texture mapping, apply box mapping, enter, 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 right? Lock, and change the scale to something much smaller. Whoops, maybe ones across the board, or maybe even 0.5. 0.75. Right, this is the quickest way in the rendered kind of view style. Just kind of like check the scale of things, right? If I wanted to take a look at it, then I can look at the interactive render. And this kind of thing will slow down the rendering a little bit, right? Just because it's kind of heavier to deal with. I might actually turn things on. Okay, so right now, actually in this file, I don't have the stuff I've had from before, so I'm actually going to go to that previous file and copy it over. So turn these things off. Glass pipes. I think that was on the pipes layer. Oh no. Okay, so I'm gonna try basically like select these things that I made earlier and try to copy them over. Actually, let's get the stairs first. Select objects, Control C, and I'm going to come over to this file and just select objects, delete, and then copy paste in. And they should theoretically come into the same place. Yes. Okay. As well as trying to get all these. So I'll actually just do this: hide, 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 and get all this. Control C, Control V. So these will just pop into place. Awesome. All right. So now you'll see there's a nice little bar, top and bottom. Okay. In terms of material choices, you know, I just generally kind of did whatever looked the closest to what was in, you know, the photos. Like it's not always going to be perfect. You can spend a lot more time trying to develop these, but you know, just kind of find what are the closest. You can also find things online if you would like. And kind of use those, or just use the sort of whatever is in here and work from there. But for the purposes of your assignment, I would just like generally work with what's here and kind of modify it just a little bit here and there. Like I said, when you develop materials, it's actually a good idea to just like kind of, you know, look at the preview and actually look at what's in your scene. Okay, so for example, let's say the glass, right? We can kind of apply it to my glass layer, and we would be able, or we would start to kind of see that as well, right? With a glass layer, then actually I am going to, for now, hide the ground because I'm getting a lot of like white kind of reflection from that ground layer. That's why that scene was like so bright. And you can kind of see the glass actually working there, right? Now, one of the things actually with this, with glass in particular, is you kind of want to control how glossy and refractive it is, right? And oftentimes for these sort of exterior renderings, you know, what I will do, like if I kind of set that view correctly to start with, right, is that you kind of want to see some reflections in it, right? And so one of the ways to kind of fake this is actually to use a high dynamic range image map. So I have the link here for this, right? This is the HDR Haven. And so these are kind of like 360-degree, you know, global spherical images of interiors and different environments, urban, whatever. This is the one I downloaded, right? I actually download this at like 8K. The higher your resolution, the better your kind of results. But 16K is like 400 megabytes. It's kind of big, right? So that's kind of the issue. So find a sort of good, compromise. But essentially, what these sort of HDRIs can help you do is, so like if you look at the spheres like here, then you would kind of get a reflection in anything that's like glass-like, right? It makes it look more realistic, but it gives you some more environmental depth, right? So to do that, actually, it's really easy. You just download it, save it somewhere. Under environment overrides, okay? You basically use that in the reflection and refraction sort of channels. So here, I will enable them both, right? Right now, it's actually just a solid color, but I will use a bitmap, right? And then go to here under, when we're picking this, go to the bitmap selection and pick this. This is the one I downloaded. So it will load, right? And then go to texture placement here under type, instead of a 2D, make it an environmental bitmap and mapping as a spherical, right? And so say okay. Now that we can actually just click and pull over and let go, which basically copies it across both channels. All right. So right now what that's doing is there's a sort of, invisible sphere, and that HDR map is mapped to the inside of this invisible sphere. And if there's any sort of reflections that are coming off of something, then it will actually, you will see that map, or you'll see that reflection. Okay. So the way to test that is actually, I'm going to pull this a little bit to the side, is now we can mess with our glass material, right? So with the glass material, actually I might want to keep it to this view, right? Because you actually usually want to develop this based on the view. I'll just zoom in a little bit. Okay, so we want to see some like stuff kind of reflecting in there, right? So two things to change. One is right here, you'll see this, but basically I would up your reflection IOR, index of refraction, to something around like maybe 7, right? So you'll see this kind of highlight shows it reflecting the sort of grid. And we start to see a little bit of like trees, right? Branches showing up in my windows here, right? A little bit, okay? So that one in particular, and also down here in refraction, I would up this to around 6 or 7 as well, right? So those two are the two kind of settings I would change, okay? So you'll see there's stuff there, right? Now sometimes, depending on your angle, depending on the map, you might kind of find this like, too distracting, or the shape or the whatever pattern maybe too prominent or just like annoying. So I will sometimes go to the environment override, right click on the reflection again, texture placement. Here we can actually control the rotation of that texture. So I think I'll try -160, right? So you'll see the reflections actually update, right? It means like that globe that we had, we're actually spinning it. And so that actually allows us to control, basically what the window is actually reflecting, right? And so kind of, okay, that's not bad, right? You have a little bit more like, smaller leaves probably, right? So gives us a more kind of closer, realistic kind of feel that like, okay, this is a project that's kind of like out in the forest, okay? Now, you probably won't see it as clearly on the sort of preview rendering like this, so let's try to do this, pull this back and change our render output back to 1600 and do this as a normal rendering, and you will start to kind of see some of the differences there. Right. This is obviously kind of depends on your sun angle and things like that, but it will, when you're doing glass, it helps with the realism of things in particular, okay? Now, one caveat I will have about this is that, and you'll see, so it might work for this angle, but in particular, if I change to an angle that's more of an interior angle, then, or more straight on angle, then the reflections might get too strong and prevent me from like seeing into the project as well, right? So there's this little kind of give and take or things that you have to kind of modify or adjust to based on that, right? So you'll see like, okay, we'll start to see all that stuff in there. Okay, so that's something to kind of do with glass in general. Okay. The other one I'll actually probably use this to show the one that is already kind of more developed. So we kind of saw doing that from this point of view, and if we look at this from this point of view, you'll see that, for example, right in this view, which is more straight onto the glass is kind of so reflective that I'm not able to see in very well. I'm getting the reflection of what's outside actually much more strongly, right? Basically the railing and stuff is getting reflected back in the glass, right? And so in this sort of situation where, okay, this view is actually more about like me trying to look in, I would adjust two things. One obviously is the direction kind of the sunlight to try to get it to work a little bit better. And then two, you can actually just like take the glass that you had, make a copy. So this is the sort of glossier version, right? This is a less glossy version, replace it to the glass layer, right? And so you'll immediately see the difference, right? That like, okay, this glass now is now more see-through glass versus the much more reflective glass that we had earlier, right? So sometimes I will run like two different types of glass just to be able to like, depending on the scene or depending on the view, actually swap them out, right? So now this one now allows me to kind of see into the interior much better. Okay. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about here actually is going to be the interior renderings. So a sort of view like this that's more of an interior, I mentioned that like, typically a rendering like this will take longer. It's much darker, right? So it's oftentimes, a lot more difficult to do, right? And if you kind of look at some of the things that like even the tutorials, the Chaos Forum kind of tutorials that I linked to here, particularly the interior rendering one, right, is they suggest to actually use a trick basically called the sky portal to light up the interiors much more strongly than what your sort of normal V-Ray sun and sky is capable of doing, right? And so this is usually kind of paired with like, using the sort of sky panel right here, right, for the view, and just obviously kind of playing with the sun angle and things like that to get the sun to kind of come in a little bit better, right? The sun direction to come in a little bit better. Pairing that with essentially the sky, the sort of sky portal trick, which is the one that actually this portal lights, right? This thing is the one that you should test. Okay, so it's actually very simple. We'll kind of go out of that view, right? And we know that in that sort of interactive rendering, like most of our sun was kind of coming in from this angle, right? So under the V-Ray kind of lights category, or here, right, V-Ray lights, we'll basically make a rectangle light, and just kind of roughly the size, or I should actually make it more orthogonal, or try to make it a bit more orthogonal. It doesn't have to be super precise. Okay, so that's a V-Ray rectangle light with an arrow, a white arrow that depicts the direction, and rotate it so it's vertical, right? And just kind of like slide it up. I know it was this sort of scene right there, right? Just kind of slide it up so it's like roughly over there. So that light will show up in the asset editor right here. Okay, so we'll go back to our interior view as a V-Ray rectangle light. But what we should do here is actually right here to make this into a portal light. Okay, there are options to make it accurate or simple. Simple should work fine. Accurate is better, but it will take longer. It takes into account to things that are below it, right? But basically what this does is that it kind of amplifies the sunlight that is going to be coming in, okay? I probably should have made this much larger, but let's take a look. And let's look at the interactive render. Okay, so this you can actually use kind of as a way to like more naturally light up the interior scene. Obviously, we can kind of come to our camera settings and mess with our exposure a little bit, right? So maybe for these interior shots, we have to up the exposure. Just don't get it so that the ground's too bright, overly bright, but that's kind of much better, right? But you can use this light setting and change the intensity to, right, use that as almost like invisible way to brighten up the scene. And so you'll see our shadows are like much like less stark than before, right? And so it will actually help with the rendering of the interior view. Okay, so portal lights like this kind of are your friend. They will kind of simulate the sunlight, the color of the sunlight. They'll match it basically, right? So don't worry about adding lights that like don't look unnatural. So you can use these, all right? But for kind of a more detailed like walkthrough, I would definitely kind of look through the lesson 3 interior rendering portion, and in particular just like the portal lights kind of portion. Okay, so for your project 2, just remember what we're asking you to do, right? Model your case studies. You just need to apply where it's appropriate 1 or 2 materials, realistic ones, like so wood, concrete, some kind of texture, right? And then glass, right? 1 or 2 materials and a glass material where it's appropriate, 2 exteriors, 2 interiors, and that's pretty much it, right? So I would start by doing the exteriors. Don't forget that actually one very good way to develop these sort of shadows and things like that is actually to right click and use the V-Ray interactive view that's within the viewport, right? So if you already have saved your set views, then all you need to do is really just to kind of rotate this so you have the right kinds of shadows that you're looking for, the right kind of look, right? Particularly in terms of the directionality of the shadows, right? So this is always really helpful to use. So I'll kind of tweak it like that, right? So for exteriors, get those done first, right? Then switch over to your interior views, right? You can kind of do the same thing, look at the shadows, but then change the things that need to be changed in terms of like glass or lighting up the interior a bit more appropriately so you can see better, in particular shots like this one where it's actually quite dark, right? Then use the V-Ray portal light to really bump it up, but also remember that you can use the exposure value, let's try 11, right, to make the scene really a lot brighter. Okay, all right, that's it.